Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Cathedral webinar, live on July 22nd, 2025. If it's your first time attending one of our webinars, Cathedral means learning in Creek. And today you will be learning about NAHASDA Tribal Council roles and responsibilities by the amazing Cheryl Cosley. My name is Brianna Birch, and I am the Training and Development Coordinator here at the Native Learning Center. And we are so honored that you all could join us today. I am going to ask that you do follow along as I read this disclaimer aloud. And this disclaimer provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that can be applicable. Also displayed here is our copyright infringement law. This is just a friendly reminder that the webinar presentation materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. And before we do get started, I want to familiarize you with the learning platform and where things can be found. I have put a link to a PDF of today's slides in the chat as well that you can see. You can also access a copy of the slides as well as access today's webinar recording in the future by going to the courses section here on our platform. Any resource items for download are also available within the online course when you go through the course pages. And just a reminder that each time you are ready to join one of our webinars moving forward, all you have to do is just log onto the website and click the large green banner that you see that will be across the top of your screen as depicted here in this picture. And when you do first join the webinar, it will prompt you to complete an audio test before joining. Please just select the listen only option so that we can avoid any audio feedback during the webinar. And if you are needing to change the speaker your sound is playing from, you can select the phone icon down at the bottom of your screen. This will bring up a list of your speaker and mic devices so that you can choose your preferred audio output. And once again, we're so happy that you are here, and we do encourage your participation today during today's webinar, and we will primarily rely on the public chat here in the left gray menu panel. You can open the public chat as well as the shared notes. If you click on the public chat, you will see a chat open between all webinar attendees, the NLC facilitator, as well as your webinar instructor. And then you can just simply click in the box that says send message to public chat, type the message that you want to send and hit enter, or click on the blue paper on the blue paper airplane icon that you see here at the bottom. And please send your comments and any questions you have into the chat, and feel free to also use the raise hand feature at the bottom right corner of the screen if you think we've missed anything along the way. Also, any tech support issues that you may have can also be submitted here as well, and I'll do my best to support you and help you navigate through it. Also, if you click on the shared notes section, you will find some helpful links like a link for today's webinar feedback survey. We do highly encourage you to complete it and so that you can let us know how we're doing. You'll also see a link to the location of our Cathedral webinars archive on our YouTube channel, a link to connect with us on LinkedIn, and as well as a link to bookmark for easy login to the Cathedral Constant Learning in the Future. And at this time, we'd really love to get to know who you are, and would be honored if you will let us know your name, where you're joining us from, your tribal affiliation, if you have one. You may also be a tribal employee, and your work or role in Indian country that may have led you to today's webinar. And as we're doing that, just one quick final note for everyone while you're introducing yourselves in the chat is to try to avoid clicking on the red menu panel all the way to the left of your screen. If you do click on the red menu panel, it will take you out of the webinar. So we don't want that. If you do accidentally click on it, however, you can just simply rejoin by one banner that I mentioned earlier at the top of the screen. And with that, it is a great pleasure that I introduce today's webinar instructor, Cheryl Causey. Cheryl, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you now.
Thank you very, very much, Brianna. Welcome back, guys. Thanks for joining us on the second day, NAHASDA roles and responsibilities of the Tribal Council. So glad that you came back. This presentation is courtesy, as she said, of the Native Learning Center and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We fall under Native American programs. So welcome and good afternoon. I went and smudged a little bit ago. You know, that's the way a lot of times in Indian country we start our stuff. So my name is Cheryl Causey. You would say Aneen in my language. Hello. My Anishinaabe name is Redbird Woman. I am Loon Clan and I come from Place of the Pike. So you would say that Kino-Shinkoning, which means the place of the pike, and that's the Bay Mills Indian Reservation. We are located at the top of Michigan in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and our waters actually border Canada. So a lot of the pictures you'll see a background in the back. Well, that's Canada. We're pretty close. We are a Ojibwe or Chippewa people. I served as director of housing for my tribe over 28 years. During that time frame, I've served as the chairperson for the Great Lakes Indian Housing Association, GLEHA. I did that for 7 years. There's 31 tribes surrounding the Great Lakes. And I was very proud to serve on the National American Indian Housing Council Board of Directors. I did that for 16 years. Started as the secretary, became the vice chair, and then served 2 terms as the chairwoman, so 4 years as the chair. I started Cheryl Causey and Associates in March of 2019. I provide training and technical assistance through the lower 48 and Alaska. I've seen quite a few of my different students, and sometimes not even the students, but I have been to their reservations and taught there before they got there even. So I'm very, very blessed to be able to continue to do, help all of our Native people and continue to do what I love, whether it be virtually or in person. So I've been doing this since 1990. It tells you kind of how old I am. So I hope you enjoy today's class and make it for the rest of the week. I know Fridays are hard on you guys, but if you could get there, I would much appreciate it. My information is at the beginning and the ending of every presentation. Please feel free to reach out to me should you ever have any questions. I will always try to get back to you. If I'm flying, it might be the next day. And if I'm teaching, it might be at the end of the day or early in the morning, but I always try to get back to you. Course description. It's to help tribal council members, but this also helps, any role that you have within housing. The more knowledge you have, the better off your program is. It gives us the background of NAHASDA and makes sure that we know of, those many requirements that we have to follow when we accept that money. Hopefully, you're going to learn something about that and how to run a successful housing program, the role in the tribal council. That's where this particular one is focused, but it's applicable to all of you. The reference materials, grab them while you can. The website's been going up and down, and sometimes it's difficult to find things. These are built specifically for this course. 1, 2, and 3 are the ones that we went through yesterday. Those are those reference materials that, I reached to, that are, a stack of them sitting here also, in order to interpret any of the rules. And sometimes the website or the publication won't get updated, right off the bat. For instance, our audit threshold went up. I don't think I have seen yet a publication on that. So it really does you good to dig in there and read those guidances, read those notices, and read those 3, the statute doesn't change very often. Those regulations, those uniform administrative requirements, well, they do. And they'll tell you when the last time they changed. But there's, you know, a lot of stuff that goes about helping your tribal people. 5, 6, and 7, you should have in a binder for your A&O department. That is the income limits. You know, those just went up in June or May. Calculating annual income. That's a brand new document. I'm very, very glad that that was updated, because the other one went all the way back to 2013. Shows you how to do the calculations, what you have to have in your A&O policy. Reference 7, you know, we talked about some of our materials. They may be old, but they're the most current one that we have for guidance. And that's 2014-02, assisting non-low income families. When you decide to assist them, this guidance is the one that gives you, you know, that path. Tells you about your essential families, tells you about your law enforcement provisions, tells you about your 10% authority, and that our non-low income people cannot receive the same amount of assistance as a low income family. So one of our areas of slippage is if we give out rehab monies or down payment assistance. Perhaps we give out $15,000 to every tribal member. Well, if the person that's applying falls between 80 and 100%, they're not allowed that full amount of assistance. You have to use one of 2 different variables that you have to pick and outline within your policy. You know, charge them a fair market value, or you run, you know, a HUD calculation about how much you can actually service them with. When you do your building, you have to build within total development cost. There's a policy status table, lists some of the policies that you are certifying that you have on hand. Conflict of interest in admissions, tribal wage rates, in case you don't want to pay that Davis-Bacon that we were talking about yesterday, useful life, binding commitments, a lot of slippage in that area also, as well as the insurance. So make sure somebody within your organization is paying attention to that. There's self-monitoring plans in here. You said you're going to do the self-monitoring. Tribal Council is ultimately responsible for the self-monitoring of that program to make sure someone does it in conjunction with the submission of your APR. Okay. New guidance on environmental review that'll help you out. Some of the things that, you know, are more common. So they've, you know, pretty much made it easier for you with that document. Some of the required policies and statements. That one goes all the way back to 2002. They haven't updated that one. Federal financial report. When we started utilizing GEMS, they changed basically when we have to submit the federal financial report. Unless you're an investment tribe, you know, you only have to do it yearly. If you're an investment tribe, you still have to do it quarterly. And the administrative requirements for investing funds. That's a new publication that also came out this year. The Federal Supply Sources, GSA, came out this year. So those are all brand new documents that you should become familiar with and, you know, have on your desk. So today, we're going to finish up with those federal labor standards, the tribal prevailing wage rate that you as a tribal council can put in place in lieu of Davis-Bacon. Some more federal requirements. Remember, I said yesterday, we're the most heavily regulated program that you probably have. Your environmental reviews, your useful life and binding commitments, other various federal requirements, the uniform relocation assistance, real property acquisition, flood insurance, lead-based paint. We get into a little bit of trouble in the lead-based paint area also. We know how old our units are, pretty much, you know, everything that we've built. And we know if they were built before a certain time, they could have lead-based paint. If they were after a certain time, well, there's none. Well, we forget to take into consideration, or it's not at the top of our docket, when we help somebody with rehab or tenant-based rental assistance or anything else, is there lead-based paint there? You can't just dismiss it because I didn't build it, you know, so pay attention to that. And then some of those Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Title 8, of the Civil Rights Act and our exemptions. And that's how we'll end up today. And then we've got some good stuff for the rest of the week. So please come back to us. So we're going to finish up with the tribal prevailing wage rate, which you as a tribe can put into place in lieu of paying Davis-Bacon. Remember, if you weren't here yesterday, or remember if you were here yesterday, and if you weren't here yesterday, if you expend over $2,000 and it is not your own tribal crew or your own housing crew doing the building, making that expenditure of funds, Davis-Bacon kicks in. So the NAHASDA Section 104B requires a prevailing wage rate determined by the Secretary of Labor, which is called a Davis-Bacon or DBRA, be applied to our NAHASDA projects. You can read about them at 1016, 29 CFR 1.2, and the guidance number that goes all the way back to 2003-04. Those would be those relevant guidance documents. So NAHASDA added a paragraph to Section 104, which allows tribes to determine or apply their own prevailing wage rate. Now, this is not a one and done, okay? You have to put it into place, and I'm not talking about, and there's confusion a lot when it comes to putting in your IHP and your APR. It will ask you questions about, do you have a tribally determined wage rate? And oftentimes, yes, we do. The tribe has a wage grid. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about how much you pay the secretaries, how much you pay the janitors, how much you pay, your grant writers. After 3 years, they go up to this amount. Well, almost every one of our tribes has a tribal wage grid. This has to do with construction, okay? NAHASDA itself is what allows a tribe to utilize, when you're expending NAHASDA funds, not tribal funds, just NAHASDA funds, because it's the NAHASDA statute that allows it, the use of a tribally determined wage rate. For other HUD programs, if NAHASDA dollars are mixed with other covered programs, NAHASDA alone is what permits the use of a tribally determined wage rate. So, application of tribal law. Paragraph 1 shall not apply to any contract or agreement for assistance, sale, or lease pursuant to the Act, they're talking about NAHASDA, if the contract or agreement is otherwise covered by one or more laws or regulations adopted by an Indian tribe that requires the payment of not less than a prevailing wage as determined by the Indian tribe. So there's certain steps that you have to undertake. The tribe itself has to pass a tribal law or regulation to apply its TDW. They have to require the payment of not less than a prevailing wage as determined by the tribe. You have to define prevailing and identify a mechanism for that determination of what your prevailing wage is. You need to design and monitor enforcement mechanisms to ensure compliance. Design the method and the frequency of your wage survey, okay? So your prevailing wage shall be the wage paid to the majority, more than 50% of the laborers and mechanics, basically all those classifications, drywallers, painters, electricians, plumbers, laborers, flaggers, truck drivers, they're all in there. In the classification on a similar project in your area during the same time period, the period in question. If the wage or the same wage is not paid to a majority of those employed within that classification, your prevailing wage shall be the averages of wages paid weighted by the total that is employed within that classification. Tribes don't need to use that definition, but you must decide on what your tribe is going to use for the definition of prevailing. Prevailing wages are not defined by HUD or NAHASDA, so you don't need to search those documents to find out what they use. It's not there. That's a tribal decision. So when you do not utilize a TDW, the following are actually, when you do utilize a tribally determined wage rate, certain labor laws do not kick in, okay? They don't apply to your NAHASDA grants. your Department of Labor laws related to Davis-Bacon, the overtime provisions of the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act, the certified payroll reports of the Copeland Anti-Kickback Act. So that is, in a nutshell, what you can do. That's one of the examples of a tribal decision, just like bringing your procurement thresholds up if you meet certain criteria, that you can do and you can undertake as a tribal leader. Or if you're one of the staff, you can bring it back to the tribal council and say, hey, would you like to consider doing this? So this next module is your environmental reviews. Not exactly my favorite. I gave a plea out yesterday, and I'm going to reiterate that. If you are a tribal leader and you have an environmental resource staff, please lend them to your housing department to help with the environmental review process. We have to do or make statements and keep files every year before we spend the money. This activity is exempt. This one is categorically excluded. This one is gonna, we have to do the full out thing. So environmental reviews are not exactly easy, and your executive director is pretty busy to begin with. We're going to talk about useful life binding commitments and some more again of those other various federal requirements. So if your housing program is large, you might have in staff to perform those important duties such as environmental reviews and other vital roles to assure you're in compliance with those various multiple federal regulations that we have to make sure that we pay attention to and adhere to. If not, as a tribal leader, this is one of the areas you can aid your housing program by allowing the utilization of existing tribal staff, environmental review staff, biologists, other tribal expertise to provide your housing staff with additional resources, lawyers, to help assure compliance with all of those regulations. So Part 58 is the environmental review process. It is environmental review process is the process of reviewing your project, the impacts you have on the environment or the potential impacts that you could have, to determine whether, you're complying with those federal, state, local standards. All HUD-assisted programs and projects are required to undergo an environmental review to evaluate how our proposed projects are going to or can affect the environment and how the environment can affect our projects, our sites, and our end users, our tribal members. So the environmental review analyzes the impact of a project on the surrounding environment and the surrounding environment on the project that we propose to build. It ensures HUD-funded projects can, provide that decent, safe, sanitary housing, and a livable community. I had one chairman for many years who said, Cheryl, your job is not just to build houses, it's to help build our community. So you're responsible. The tribal leaders are responsible for the safety of all of their tribal members. They have huge jobs. To demonstrate compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and the related federal laws and authorities has to be conducted before any funds are even committed. So the regulations are found at 24 CFR 58. There's a new guidance that is in your reference materials, PIHN 2024-24. It's an environmental review guidance. It's very helpful for you. We also have a program called HEROES, which you can access through Code Talk for the purposes of our environmental reviews. I would also, highly recommend you peruse that and learn how to use that. So NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, passed by Congress in 70 in response to a national consensus that all of our federal agencies should take the lead in providing, for protection of our environment. It requires our federal agencies to consider the environmental impact of any, proposed actions really early in our planning and decision-making process. It's designed to encourage public participation. All documents, developed and used are supposed to be available to the public. Now, once you get into some training for environmentals, they will show you what documents you can keep private, locations of, domestic shelters and different, there's a few things that you can keep private, but you need to know what those are also. So the final rule, the government-wide NEPA procedures came about in 2024. They published the bipartisan permitting reform implementation final rule, updating, the NEPA regulations, which HUD is subject to. They went into effect in July of 2024. And applies to new environmental reviews started after July 1st of 2024, regardless of the level of the review. You view the information on that final rule and guidance on new HUD environmental reviews. These are active links for you. You can click on there and it will bring up the information that you need on a new government-wide NEPA procedures page. For additional questions, you can reach out to your HUD's environmental officer. If they don't have one within your local EWONAP office, they will connect you to an office that has one. So you need to know the difference between Part 50 and Part 58. So HUD's response to NEPA was developing Part 50. 50 basically allows HUD to act as our responsible entity. Okay, we have to give them all of the same information that we would gather under Part 58. Part 50 and 58 outline the environmental review procedures to follow to ensure HUD projects comply with NEPA. The first step is determining whether your assistance is going to fall under Part 50, Part 58. It's usually specified also in your notice of your NOFA, your Notice of Funding Availability, your program regulations, and within the legislation. 50 applies to programs where HUD is going to act and perform your environmental reviews. Not very many of our housing entities utilize this. I don't even know if our HUD offices are open full-time yet. For a long time, they were in there 1 and 2 days a week, and then not at all for a large period of time. So the majority of our tribes utilize Part 58. It applies to programs that allow a responsible entity to perform your environmental reviews. The regulations at 58 allow the responsible entity, okay? Normally, the responsible entity, when it comes to environmental reviews, is your tribal chairperson, okay? They are the certifying officer, the CO, or their designee, to sign and take legal responsibility for that review. They need to be able to stand in federal court and say, yes, we made this decision, and that is our, that's why it goes up so far within the ladder. It's usually not the housing authority that does that for certain things, okay? Part 58 applies when program legislation allows local governments to assume authority. Our HUD programs, particularly those under public and Indian housing, community planning, development divisions, authorize REs to assume HUD's environmental review responsibilities under 24 CFR Part 58. And you can actually see a current list of those programs under 58.1. Where programs, where the recipient of HUD funds is a unit of local government, such as a tribe, that entity is your responsible entity, your RE. You can read about that at 58.2-7 and the program regulations for more information. The Part 58 environmental reviews have to demonstrate compliance with a number of environmental laws and authorities in addition to NEPA. All Part 58 environmental reviews, including those that are exempt and categorically excluded, not subject to 58.5, have to comply with the related laws and the authorities that are listed at 58.6. Airport hazards notification, runway clear zones, coastal barrier resources, flood insurance, the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973, and the Flood Insurance Reform Act of 1994. Then you have some undertakings, when you're disturbing properties and disturbing ground, that will require a higher level of review. Only reviews that require a higher level of a review, categorically excluded subject to 58.5, environmental assessments, environmental impact statements, address additional laws and authorities at 24 CFR .58. The Air Quality Clean Air Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, contamination, toxic substances, endangered species, explosive and flammable hazards, and farmland protection and farmland protection policy. Okay. So as I said, there is new guidance material at 2024, part 24, and it is in your reference materials. Your environmental review process should begin in your project planning earliest stage to maximize the consideration of alternatives and opportunities to improve your project design. Important that that review is completed prior to the commitment of any funds. That's what will get you into trouble. And you might have to repay the funds if you do that. So pay attention to your environmental reviews. The regulations of 5822 prohibit your grant recipients and their partners, which means the tribe too, from committing or spending HUD or non-HUD funds on any activity that could have an adverse environmental impact or limit the choice of your reasonable alternatives prior to the completion of an environmental review, if applicable, after the receipt of the authority to utilize your grant funds, which you get from HUD. So the restriction on the undertaking of committing funds for choice limiting actions does not apply to undertakings or commitments of a non-federal fund before a project participant has applied for HUD funding. Okay. A party can begin a project in good faith and on a private project, and they're not precluded from later deciding to utilize or apply for, federal assistance. However, once that party applies for federal assistance, you need to basically cease operations when it comes to that. You cease the further choice limiting actions on your project until your environmental review process is complete. So you don't, take action which would stop you from taking certain roads. So your ERR, your environmental review record, it's unique for every project. It contains a description of all the activities part of the project, evaluates the appropriateness of the site you have selected. It's going to document compliance with your environmental requirements. It's the record of determinations, findings, and it contains various source documents and relevant data. And it has to be made available, again, like I said, for public review. If the project name, the environmental review, contains information that could be considered sensitive, such as a location of a domestic violence shelter, a sacred site falls in here, endangered species habitat. I've seen, the box turtle stopped, construction cold. The RE should omit that information from the publicly reviewable environmental review record. You include it in the one that you submit, but the one that you would pass out, you wouldn't have that information in there. And you can always ask HUD for guidance on how to do that. Bottom line, all week long, if you ever have a question and they, call your HUD office, call your local ONAP office. If they don't know the answer, they'll run it up the ladder and they'll get it for you. Might take a couple of days, but they'll get you an answer. Get their answer in writing and keep that also, though, because, sometimes those people transfer somewhere else and you need, just like your meeting minutes, this is what they told me I could do. Well, show that to me in writing. Well, here it is. Always do that. So your environmental review process is a series of actions documented in your ERR, that environmental review record. Define the project, where it is, the purpose of the project, the benefit that you're going to achieve, the impact of the community, the market. Well, I'm going to build low rent units. I'm going to benefit 50 occupants. It's going to give them a place to live. Determine the level of review from the project activities, the description, determine the 4 review types it's required. Perform your environmental review analysis, document your compliance in accordances with the requirements for whatever level of review that is. Finalize your review, get your signatures and approvals as appropriate, expend project funds after, and you can then complete that task. Your post-review considerations. You confirm you did the required mitigation measures, that they were implemented. You monitor your environmental compliance on your completed project. Request and receive HUD approval as needed or if it's actually applicable. So in order to define your project, that description is the foundation of your environmental review. Decisions are made based on information provided within your description. To start a review, you have to ask, what is the project? The test of a good project description is someone with no familiarity with the project or a HUD program should be able to read the description and fully understand what that project is going to do or will do. It will be used throughout your environmental review process. For example, when advertising for public comment. Your description should provide location-specific information, geographic boundaries, as well as a delineation of all physical activities included in your overall scope of your project. So, in order to define the project, purpose of the project, where's the location, what's the size of the parcel, the buildings, what's your existing conditions? Do you have any trends or economic demographics? The scope of work to be performed, changes that are going to be made to the structure or to your land. Who is the beneficiaries? How many people are going to benefit? How many numbers and the types? Low income, very low income. Benefits of and impact to your community. Maybe we're going to get rid of, we hope to get rid of 30 homeless. Not get rid of, house 30 homeless. Excuse me for that. Funding sources and your HUD funded amount and total project cost. Defining it, those project descriptions should contain a narrative, a site plan, visual aids. Your narrative should be brief, contain all the basics, size, parcel, buildings, functions, clients, think the basics of who, when, where, why, how. And your housing project description should clearly state the number and type of units, as well as fully describe any non-dwelling spaces that you're going to build or provide. The project description should include all your contemplated actions that are a composite part of that project. It'll be covered on the aggregation slide, and then capture the maximum scope of the proposal, not just a single activity that federal money is funding. And it is not to be tied directly to your budget line items. So aggregation is looking at your whole project, as a whole, not just the part funded by federal dollars. Is the activity part of a larger project? Is it just one phase of a larger development? Do you have additional phases of the project, and have you applied for funding? Does your activities take place in a target area where a whole range of varying activities are planned? And if the answer to any of those is yes, then your project should be what they call aggregated, okay? So the RE must group together your responsible entity, evaluate as a single project all individual activities related either on a geographic or a functional basis or both, and they are logical parts of contemplated actions. Don't leave me, guys. We'll get through this. Environmentals are not fun. But we have to. It's a necessary evil. So bear with me and we'll get through this part. So geographical, the objective is to complete a single environmental review considering all your related activities for a project at a specific location, regardless of the source of the funding. Could be tribal dollars, Functional activities have to be similar in nature with similar types of environmental impacts. For example, federal funds are going to be used to rehabilitate a gymnasium, which is going to be part of a larger project that includes a new construction of a youth community center that will be assisted with local funds. Maybe we're going to build a boys and girls club, good thing to have on your reservation. Determining the level of your review, Part 58. So based on that project description, the RE determines the level of your environmental review that is required, the amount of work, the documentation, that RE will need for your environmental review record will depend upon the level of that environmental review. So the length, so those clouds in the background, that's how far I am from Canada. Those are windmills, those red things there. So that's standing on our reservation looking at Canada. Levels of review under Part 58, there's 4 levels of review. If it's exempt, categorically excluded from NEPA, not subject to your related laws and authority, it's 58.5. I always called it sensed. Categorically excluded from NEPA, subject to the related laws and authorities, 58.5 CEST. Then you have the environmental assessment, which is an EA, and you have an environmental impact statement, which is an EIS. You have certain activities which are exempt. They're set forth at 24 CFR 5834. That guidance that I keep talking to you about in your reference material, it talks about a lot of exempt things in there. It'll save you some time. Environmental planning, design cost, information, financial services, administrative management activities, public services, no physical impact on the land, inspections, purchase of tools, insurance, technical assistance, training, payment of principal and interest, most types of temporary assistance for disaster or imminent threat, engineering or design cost. So unless you're building something, you know, sometimes your environmental review goes a lot quicker, but you still have to learn how to do it. So categorically excluded, not subject to 58.35B, sensed. Those activities have been determined by HUD that they would not alter any conditions that would require a review or compliance determination under your federal laws and authorities cited at 58.5. For projects found to fit into one of these categories, your RE only has to document compliance with those requirements of 58.6. They don't have to undertake any environmental assessment, consultation, or other action under NEPA or related laws and authorities in 58.5. What you have to do under all these circumstances is make sure that you keep this information and you have it in a place that is retrievable. It might be 5 years till HUD knocks on your door for your monitoring, okay? These are going to be one of the items that they're going to probably request. Even if you move offices or whatever, there's certain files that 3-year period does not apply to, okay? Your environmentals, your procurement documents, your contracts, certain things like that you keep forever, okay? This is one of them, and make sure you know where they're at and that they're retrievable. Maybe scan them in also and keep them on, you know, within the website also. So not subject to 58.35. They're similar to those exempt activities. They're generally activities that are not, again, going to have a physical impact on your environment. Categories within that activities within that category will include tenant-based rental assistance, TBRA, supportive services, healthcare, housing placement, operating costs, utilities, supplies, economic development costs not associated with construction or expansion, some types of homebuyer assistance, affordable pre-development cost, maintenance, supplemental assistance to previously approved activities. We are not supposed to pay for healthcare with NAHASDA. Just because that's in there doesn't mean it's an allowable expense on our behalf. There was another one in there that catches my eye once in a while too. But make sure that you're still spending your money the way you should. The compliance for exempt and sensed reviews, the sensed and exempt activities fall under different levels of review. They're described in separate sections. The compliance procedure and the requirements are the same. However, for an exempt or a sensed activity, the RE is required to make a written, signed, and dated determination that that activity is exempt, or CENST. The determination must be made before you expend any type of HUD funds. So compliance, document in your ERR your activity complies with the requirements listed at 58.6. You're adhering to the airport clear zones, purchase the sailor land, coastal barriers resource, flood insurance requirements. And even though exempt and sensed activities do not require compliance with 58.5 or NEPA, your RE must still establish an ERR, document compliance with the requirements at 58.6, and their RE may use the exempt sensed environmental review format to document compliance with the requirements at 58.6. Almost, guys. Categorically excluded, subject to 58.5, activities category assessed will usually have a physical impact. They're more specifically defined at 58.35, and they include acquisition, leasing, disposition of vacant land or existing buildings with no change in land use, and includes project-based rental assistance. Acquisition of leasing of public facilities with no change in land use. Removal of barriers that restrict mobility and accessibility to your elderly and handicapped. Rehabilitation, repair, improvement of buildings as described at 24 Part 58.35. Projects that are assessed under 58.35 have to comply with the related federal laws and authorities listed at 58.5 and 6. Those 13 laws and authorities are, and the 3 requirements under 58.6 were formally referred to as a statutory checklist. Your RE must ensure the project complies with each of those laws and authorities. Each compliance determination has to be supported by documentation in your ERR. So you complete compliance with 58.5 and 6, obtain necessary signatures to complete your review, publish and post your notice of intent to request a release of funds and certification, if applicable. As required, wait that 7-day comment period to elapse. If you're posting it, it's a 10-day period. Respond accordingly to any comments you should receive. If applicable, submit your request for your release of funds and certification to HUD. It's on Form 7015.15. HUD will approve the release of funds with an authority to use your grant funds after the HUD 15-day public comment period if no valid objection exists. So there's a clock ticking the whole time. So you know, it's really smart to get a head start on this stuff if you can, so you can get your money released. Extraordinary circumstances, situations where an EA or an EIS would not normally be required, but you have an unusual condition which necessitates an increasing your project level of review, which could include examples such as unique or unprecedented actions, actions substantially similar to those that would normally require an EA or an EIS, actions which could alter an existing HUD policy or mandate, locations where unusual physical conditions may have a significant impact, either because the project can significantly impact the environment or because the environment could have a significant impact on the residents or the users of your facility or the facility that you're building. So this is where I live, right in the middle here. That's Canada back there. So your assessment under NEPA, environmental assessments determine whether a project's going to have a significant impact on the human environment. If it will not, your review concludes with making a finding of no significant impact, a FONSI. However, if your RE makes a finding of significant impact, then an environmental impact statement is required. If you have no categorical exclusion or exemption, that applies, and the project does not require an EIS under 5837. It is EA by default. Generally, those projects include new construction, demolition, major repairs, rehab, any activity that involves a change in your land use. EAs may also be required when extraordinary circumstances exist that elevate the level of review for an otherwise categorically excluded project. If they cannot be categorized as exempt or categorically excluded, as I just described, then an environmental assessment has to be prepared. In addition to compliance with those other related laws and authorities found at 58.5, other requirements at 58.6, your EAs have to consider any type of potential impact on the project, on the environment, and it includes an analysis of the project's direct, indirect, and cumulative impact on your land development, your socio-economic factors, community facilities and services, natural features referred to as the environmental assessment factors. So you have to have complete compliance with 58.5 and 6, determine the impact of each environmental assessment factor, perform your impact analysis for your project as a whole, make a determination of a finding of no significant impact or a finding of significant impact. Publish your FONSI notice or your notice of intent to request your release of funds. Wait for your 15-day or 30 days if it's controversial comment period to elapse. Respond accordingly to any comment received. Submit your release for request for release of funds and certification on your HUD Form 7015.15 to HUD. So, the analysis. There is also something called a Wiser Curriculum module available through HUD and the Office of Environment and Energy for instruction on how to determine compliance with each environmental law and authority, how to complete your EA analysis, floodplain management, flood insurance, wetlands, coastal barrier resources, coastal zone management, sole source aquifers, airport hazards, and environmental justice. Review to that curriculum model available through HUD on how to determine compliance with each of those environmental laws and authorities and how to complete that EA analysis. Endangered species, explosive and flammable facilities, wild and scenic rivers, farmland, noise abatement and control, air quality, historic preservation, site contamination, and your environmental assessment factors. So the statements of 58.37 are required when your EA concludes in a finding of significant impact. The complexity of that project exceeds the scope of an EA. Extraordinary circumstances exist and elevate the level of review. Projects that involve 2,500 or more housing units or beds. Not very many of our tribes build like that. C24 CFR 58.37. Your RE has to use your EIS format recommended by the Council on Environmental Quality unless a determination is made on a particular project that there is no compelling reason to do otherwise. If a project may require an EIS, contact your field or regional environmental officer as soon as possible for assistance, and then you finalize your review. Once your review preparer has determined documented compliance with all the required factors, you can begin to finalize that review. Depending on the level of the review, different measures have to be taken in order to complete it. If the review is exempt or sensed, then the environmental review preparer can simply document your findings, gather your signatures, and place it in your project file. If it is CEST, EA, or EIS, then your RE has to submit a request for release of funds and certification to HUD, and that review process for the levels of review are not officially complete until your RE receives the authority to utilize grant funds on the HUD Form 7015.16. So the first step is completing your review, finish that process, package that review record, your ERR, includes making sure all your compliance requirements are finished, your determinations are made. For exempt and sensed reviews, you have to document the project meets one or more of the categories listed at 58.34 or 35 and 24 CFR 58.6. Since those exempt and sensed reviews do not require a request for a release of funds and certification, your environmental review preparer can simply obtain any necessary signatures, place that ERR in your project file or wherever they store your environmental records. Sometimes they'll store them with your legal department. That's, up to your tribal leaders how you want that done. So your reviews after completing the compliance with the laws and authorities listed at 58.5 and 6, your review preparer has to consider any mitigation, compliance measures, if anything's required like that. And if you have no circumstances which require compliance with the laws and authorities at 58.5, you're not in a floodplain, there's no mitigation required, no conditions on the project, then the review can actually convert over to exempt. So if it converts to exempt after your documents and your RE documents the conversion to exempt, determination in your ERR and the ERR itself is signed, dated, and the project can now be undertaken. Your RE does not have to follow your public notice and comment procedures or submit a request to release of funds to your HUD office. So if anything triggers, one or more compliance determinations is triggered, then your environmental review cannot convert to exempt, and you have to publish the notice of the intent to request the release of funds, allow the public to review and comment, submit a request for release of funds from HUD, and for those reviews, your environmental review is not complete until your RE receives the authority from HUD to utilize those funds. So after you complete that compliance and your EA analysis, you have to make your finding that it's either a finding of no significant impact to FONSI, a finding of significant impact. If you have a finding of significant impact, then your RE has to proceed with that EIS. If there is a FONSI, you can finalize the review, follow the steps, obtain all your signatures, prepare your signature, and certify your certifying officer's signature. Publish your notice of availability of the FONSI and notice of intent to the request to release funds and certification to HUD. Read and respond to any public comments that you receive. Submit your request to release the funds and wait for HUD's authority to utilize your grant funds on Form 701516. And I thought I was done. So, CEST EIS reviews require your RE to inform your public of their intent to submit that request of release of funds on that certification, provide the public with an opportunity to comment. It's called the Notice of Intent to Request Release of Funds and Certification, or NOI. And you review that, any RROF CEST reviews that convert to exempt are not required again to give that public notice. You have to post or publish in a manner where the public can easily find it. Could mean publishing in a local newspaper, posting in a public building such as a public library or your tribal office, or wherever you post your APRs, or your notice to HUD that you're housing somebody that's related to, a decision maker. So you should have a place to post things like that. Your public notices, your comment period has to include a brief project description, any findings, the address of the office where your public can submit comments on, regarding that project. In addition, it also requires a notice of FONSI, which can be combined with the request for the release of funds. HUD templates for all those public notices can be found at the environmental review on the HUD exchange or through Code Talk. So these are how long you have to put them out for. Some are 7 days, some are 10 days when you're mailing and you're posting, some are 15 days, some are 18 when mailing and posting, 15 and 18. And public comment. You have to consider and respond to comments, modify your environmental review or the project if you get if appropriate, in response to comments before submitting for that request of release of funds. In addition to publishing or posting your notices, you disseminate your FONSI notice to any governmental entities or agencies with expertise in any identified issues, any members of the public known to be interested or affected by the action, your local news media, the EPA regional offices, the HUD field offices. Many REs actually develop a standard distribution list for their HUD funded projects. So this is what some of that paperwork looks like. Program description, provide the project information, the activities that make up the project, the environmental certification. You certify all the responsibilities for that review have been fully carried out. Certify that the proposal did not require preparation, dissemination of an environmental impact statement. And your certifying officer signs a section and has to do so after the public comment period has closed. This area is when the recipient of program funds is not the responsible entity. Should be completed only when there's a recipient of the program funds is not the RE. Most common when a recipient is a public housing authority or a nonprofit, your housing entity. If the recipient's authorized officer signs this section to certify that you agreed to abide by all the special conditions, procedures, requirements of the environmental review, to advise the RE of any proposed change in the scope of the project or any change within the environment. So prepare that package for your HUD program office. If you're using HEROES, your package is going to get submitted electronically. If not, you actually do the mailing, you fill it out, you prepare the package to send to the HUD program office. The package should include the following: your notices, your FONSIs, your request for release of funds, your floodplain management notices, proof of publication for posting of all your notices, copies of comments received, your responses to those comments, signed original request of release of funds and certification, and you should not send your entire environmental review package, okay? Call your HUD office if you have any problems. What do I send? They'll tell you. So it can be rejected if any of the following conditions apply. If they have knowledge that the RE did not properly conduct that environmental review, HUD finds inaccuracies in the certification for the request for release of funds, if they receive valid public objections attesting to the inaccuracy or non-compliance of your environmental review. If they receive no valid objections, they're going to prepare the authority to use your grant funds, and you can begin spending and committing funds for the project only when you receive the form from HUD. Post-review considerations. Environmental review records are considered living documents until the completion of the entire project and the implementation of all mitigation. They sometimes need to be updated, even though the environmental review has already been completed. The three major reasons for revisiting your review is to record mitigation measures, reevaluate the project, or add another source of funding. So mitigation measures and conditions, they are conditions for approval, sometimes necessary for a project to be in compliance. Mitigation measures are steps taken to avoid or minimize any possible adverse effects of actions and have to be included in your project implementation. They're often implemented after your environmental review is complete and the project is underway. Documentation demonstrating the mitigation measures have been completed and should be included in your ERR. A reevaluation is completed, and while the project is still underway, it could be necessary under the following circumstances found at 58.47. You propose a substantial change in the nature or the magnitude of the extent of the project. You add a new activity not anticipated in your original scope of project, or proposing section of an alternative not considered in your original review. You have circumstances or environmental conditions which could affect the project or have a bearing on its impact, an unexpected condition discovered during the implementation of the project. Your ERR should be updated. Your RE should confirm whether the original findings are still valid. If the original findings are no longer valid, a new environmental assessment has to be prepared. If it's completed, the project is completed. Any proposed change in the scope reviewed requires a separate ER. So now you see why I'm asking if you guys have people within your staff that can help with this. It would be much appreciated. You can also pay somebody to do this on behalf of your housing entity if you do not have the expertise, or you're getting into building. There's certain things that you'll learn that is exempt. But then if you start building and you start doing things like that, you might want to hire somebody to do this on your behalf, okay? Additional HUD funding sources are sometimes added to the project after your review is completed. For those new sources, that a sensed environmental review can be performed. If your original environmental review, the additional sources of all funding all fall under Part 58, and the same RE is performing the review. You can read about that at 58.35B7. If the new funding sources are added prior to the completion of the environmental review, all of the funding sources are under the same Part 50 or 58, then the new funding can be included in your existing environmental review. And I am so sorry. That's just something that our tribal leadership has to know about, that we have to know, that we have to complete. It's not by any means an interesting subject. At least I don't find it is. But it's a necessary evil, I guess you would say. So it's really important that you have somebody that does this on your behalf, whether you hire it out, you got somebody within the tribe, or you train somebody within your housing entity. Because it's in an area where you can get yourself into a lot of trouble if it's not done correctly, or if you don't maintain those documents. Also, usually that RE is your tribal chairperson, so you don't want to do any wrong there, you know. So this other part, we have major slippage in Indian country with the provisions about insurance and useful life and binding commitments when we use NAHASDA dollars, you know, in the form of rehab and things like that. We are supposed to have useful life and binding commitments, and we're actually supposed to have a binding commitment on the land that our tribal members are supposed to go and get. And a lot of times we don't. So the program guidance, the most recent program guidance, which is in your reference materials 2020-02, there is a prior one that you can pull up and use. For example, I always had both of them. It's 2014-09. This one has an FHA loan rider in it for those of you who utilize the FHA program. The other ones don't. The intent of the guidance is to give you as a recipient information about maintaining your assisting housing and non-housing projects for the useful life of your properties. So yesterday, I started out and I said, Congress appropriates the money for the benefit of low-income Native Americans. This kind of falls right along that pattern, okay? When you utilize that money, you know, the intent of the guidance is to give you information about maintaining your housing projects, your non-housing projects for useful life of the property. It's going to clarify what satisfactory to the secretary is, what constitutes an acceptable binding commitment. And as I said, this guidance has been updated to include language if you utilize the FHA program for any of your mortgages. This goes, it's got a couple of decisions that have to be made during it and steps that your housing authority has to have in place. The NAHASDA statute requires that our housing remains affordable for the remaining useful life of the property as determined by the secretary. And you're going to see that language a lot. If you ever see the language as determined by the secretary, it usually applies to your IHP or APR. And you include whatever it's talking about in those documents. So your useful life and binding commitment is in your IHP. There's been times where I've asked directors, you know, about their useful life and binding commitments, and they look at me. I said, are you the one that writes your IHP? And they'll say, yeah. I said, can I see it? And there it is. And they don't even know what it means. I was one of those skeptical people who thought, I remember when this came out years ago, and they, what's the useful life on your properties? And I remember talking to my assistant, and I said, half of me wants to put 100 years down here because I'm afraid they're going to quit our subsidy once the useful life has ran out. But that was not what was meant behind that, you know. But you have to say how long your properties are going to have a useful life to them. For such, and when you put it, you describe that in your IHP, and they approve your IHP, then it is, you've met that definition of as determined by the secretary, because they've approved your IHP. That's how, you know, you meet those conditions. So it requires housing units remain affordable for either the remaining useful life of the property as determined by the secretary, so whatever you put in your IHP, or for other period that the secretary determines is the longest feasible period of time consistent with sound economics and the purposes of NAHASDA. Useful life is the time period during which an assisted property has to remain affordable. The statute and the regulations require your affordability period be secured through a binding commitment satisfactory to the Secretary. Purpose and the intent of that binding commitment is to guarantee, remember, low-income Native Americans. The purpose and intent of requiring binding commitments is to guarantee the housing will remain affordable for its useful life, that affordability period. The binding commitment requirement under NAHASDA not only applies to the parties, the people, okay, it applies to the property, so the land that it's sitting on. Regardless of who may have entered into that agreement, because it's running with the land, not the binding commitment, okay? The binding commitment required cannot be satisfied solely with the contract between the parties, okay? So this is where sometimes either the housing entity doesn't pay attention to this at all and doesn't do it, or they have a written agreement, but they don't have anything binding, the binding commitment running with the land. So there's like several stages to this, regardless of who can be in possession of it. So the binding commitment required cannot be satisfied solely with the contract between the parties, pursuant to 1144. You can read about that in the regs. In order for it to be satisfactory to HUD, a written use restriction has to be placed on the assisted property and run with the land. Hence, the binding commitment must be recorded. So depending upon the type of land, your participant is going to have to either go to the BIA, or they're going to go to the Register of Deeds or whoever records your properties within the jurisdiction that you're in, okay? So it's a lien, basically, on the land that the housing entity holds. Your affordability period. The first primary objective as NAHASDA stated at 201, develop, maintain, operate affordable housing for occupancy by low-income Indian families, as I told you like 3 times. Every time funds are spent on a property, an investment is made in low-income families within your community. The return on the investment is the period of continued future use, during which the property will be available for use by low-income families. The period of future use is your affordability period, or useful life for that property. Housing units constructed, developed, rehabbed, using block grant funds have to establish a useful life to ensure that property will remain available to low-income families. So the determination of your affordability period. Generally, your affordability period is a period of time which the property is going to be available for use for your low-income families. Should be the remaining useful life of the property as approved by HUD when they approve your IHP, or the longest feasible period of time consistent with sound economics and the purposes of NAHASDA as approved by HUD in your IHP. In determining a property's affordability or useful life, you could use a tiered schedule similar to that used by the department's home program in determining that affordability period. It would specify a number of years during which the housing must remain affordable, dependent upon the amount of block grant funds being invested in the property per occurrence. For example, this is the one, and it's in your IHP. Very similar, probably, that lists how much money and for how long. Now, this is the one, when I started looking for it, I saw in over 90% of the cases. Now, I saw in a really, really high income area where it was less, okay? And I saw up with one of my Alaskan clients that I go see. I get to go up, I was up there last month and I get to go back up in September. They have longer ones. They have longer ones because it costs so much to build up there. Everything has got to get shipped in. So this did not make sense, and their office approved a different one. So depending on, you know, if your ducks are in a row, your IHPs get approved quite readily or whatever. you might want to tweak this. It's something that you can look at, or you could be happy with that amount of years. The other decision that has to be made by your decision makers, whether that be your board of commissioners or your tribal council, don't know who does what there, is your recovery period. Is it going to be a prorated, or is it going to be a single recovery? So if I take $10,000 for 5 years and it was prorated, it would go down $2,000, a year. If it was a single recovery amount, I would could be in the 4.5 year and have to pay it all back. So my housing authority used prorated. And I actually had a staff member, and I asked if I could talk about it, who used it for down payment assistance. Purchased a house off of the reservation, married to a non-native, got divorced, sold the house. A non-native bought it. A non-native, non-low-income person bought it. So she was responsible for paying back the prorated remaining amount. You have to go back after that amount from them, or HUD, you'll get in trouble. At the end of this discussion, at the end of these slides, it'll show you where you can get in trouble. So keep all that in mind. Go look at your IHP, see if it's in there, see what you're saying you have, and then see if you have those, or you're requiring those commitments to run with that land also. So for relatively minor investments, your designated affordability period could be a nominal period of time. NAHASDA requires some period be designated. Has to be secured with a binding commitment. Additionally, if the reasonable affordability period is less than 1 year, the binding commitment is required. Okay, so the written one. But it's not necessary to record your written use restriction for purposes of complying with NAHASDA. So you wouldn't need the binding agreement on the land. It is a good business practice, though. However, to record your written use restrictions for purposes of giving notice to your subsequent purchasers, the dollar ranges, the corresponding number of years can differ from those shown, depending upon your local conditions and what you can get approved in your IHP. The recipient may choose to assign a longer affordability period in order to assure the availability of a larger continuing affordable housing supply for your low-income families. Now, I have not seen a longer one. I'll be on, that's me being honest with you. If you choose to use some other method of assigning your affordability period, your IHP should describe how the method provides for an affordability period with appropriate considerations given to your unique local conditions. Okay, I'm in Alaska and it costs me 3 times as much to build a house than it does, I don't know if my friend, I've got somebody here that I've actually been at their housing authority. They're in Oklahoma. They're in the middle of, lots and lots and lots of houses and Home Depots and building things. I'm 3 hours from one where I live. Those conditions have a big effect on your cost and your total development cost and things like that also. Your IHP should describe how the method provides for an affordability period with appropriate considerations given to any unique local conditions. In setting your useful life, a specific number of years should be given for your affordability period, not a range of years, 30 to 40, or any general statements. The number of years should also be without ambiguous qualifications about approximately, if it's properly maintained, planned, expected, or estimated. Similarly, your designated affordability period should in no way be contingent upon the continuation of block grant funding. So in order to report your useful life, a description of your plan or system for determining your useful life of the housing you assist with your block grant funds have to be provided in your IHP. To record your current specific useful life, your housing units assisted with block grant funds should be maintained in your files and available for review. I don't know if your auditor will look at it, but HUD definitely will during their monitoring. Types of properties and assistance covered. The useful life provisions apply to all housing units and non-housing units assisted with block grant funds, except for mutual help houses that you have that current assisted stock built with 1937 Housing Act stuff, okay? Those funds, those mutual help houses are exempt from this. Your initial home buyer, any subsequent homeowner that purchases the property during the period of useful life need only qualify as low income at the time of their purchase. In other words, if your initial owner seeks to sell the property while it still has a remaining useful life or an affordability period assigned to it, your new home buyer or buyer must qualify as an eligible family at the time of his or her purchase. So being non-low income, non-native, my girl was, out of luck. However, okay, the transfer of a home ownership unit to a family member, and then this has got language in here that is not in the rest of our usual language, or a household member. They don't have to be a family member. They could be a household member. Is not subject to a binding commitment for the remaining useful life of the property. Thus, if the home ownership unit has been transferred to a family member or a household member, your written use restriction will not terminate, even though it will not apply. You just keep tracking it. You do that because if they subsequently transfer, that unit again by that family member or household member to a third party who is not a family member or household member, it is then subject to any remaining useful life or affordability period under your recorded binding commitment. So if it's like in a new house, it could be up to 20 years. They could be 12 years in at that point. It would kick in again. So you'd keep counting that time off of there. Should the home be sold during its useful life period to a new purchaser that does not qualify as a family member, household member, or an eligible family, and funds are not repaid to you as a recipient's block grant program in accordance with your useful life plan, the secretary will take appropriate action against the IHBG recipient, you, in accordance with Section 401 of NAHASDA. So you have to get the money or they're going to come after your funds with it. I don't know how they're going to, I guess I should read some more on that. They probably just take it out of your grant amount. So your low-income owner, occupant of privately owned housing, which receive block grant funded assistance, whether it be in the form of a loan or a grant, for moderate or substantial rehab. Okay, so this applies to your rehab programs also. Need only be low income at the time the assistance is provided. However, there should be a binding commitment accompanying your assistance that guarantees an appropriate useful life or affordability period, provides for remedies of the breach of such useful life upon transfer of ownership during that useful life period. Okay. Your useful life and binding commitment requirements apply to all housing units assisted with block grant funds, including units developed through the Title VI program, the loan guarantee program. So it reaches out there also. So should you use NAHASDA funds to undertake a model activity for a non-housing project? The useful life provisions apply to all model activities, non-housing projects constructed, developed, or acquired with your block grant funds to ensure the remaining useful life of the property will be maintained for affordable housing activities. So you don't turn the maintenance barn into a bingo parlor. My thought. So, non-housing projects include community centers, model activities established to provide affordable housing activities. So you have to record your use restrictions. Records have to be kept for all use restrictions. There's a sample record of use restrictions form in the guidance that can be used by you to record both NAHASDA and other affordability or use restrictions. They can vary in how They are imposed, and a model reporting form is designed to be the registry of all various use restrictions placed on recipient properties. Acceptable binding commitments, as mentioned earlier, NAHASDA requires there be a binding commitment satisfactory to the Secretary in place to ensure your housing unit, that's my warning bell, in place to ensure that a housing unit will remain affordable for its useful life. When your block grant funds are used, either in the form of a grant or a loan, to purchase, construct, rehabilitate a residence, they're purchase or construct, okay? Remember all that. There must be a written agreement in place between the block grant recipient, the individual who is being assisted with the funds. The written use agreements have to include provisions for the block grant recipient or your IHBG useful life or affordability period restrictions as specified within your IHP. So that means your down payment assistance program, your rehab program, any model activities that you utilize your funds on. Acceptable binding commitments. The provisions must be imposed by recorded deed restrictions, covenants running with the land, or other mechanisms approved by HUD, except that the useful life restrictions may terminate upon foreclosure by a lender or transfer in lieu of foreclosure, as long as the action is not for the purpose of avoiding the income as long as the action is not for the purpose of avoiding low income affordability restrictions, okay? The written use restriction or agreement may contain a schedule outlining a payback of a decreasing balance of assistance or percentage equity over the useful life or affordability period that would have to be reimbursed to your program if a subsequent occupant does not meet your eligibility requirements. So you have types of binding commitments, and there are samples within that guidance, okay? There's 2 types of every one except, I believe, the FHA. It depends. The 6 samples are depending on what type of land they're on. So this is a useful life restriction for fee land, okay? And it requires the full amount. Okay, so it's the amount of payback, which one you're going to use. This one is for fee land, and it is a prorated recovery amount. So like I said, you got to pick if it's going to be prorated or if it's going to be, full payment in full. Same thing. This one is trust land, both types, okay? And then the last one is your FHA loan rider, because some grantees use block grant funds to provide down payment assistance to low-income Native American borrowers who receive a loan insured by FHA. Because FHA requirements under 24 CFR 203.41, the sample useful life restriction contains language that limit transfer of property in the event of a foreclosure. The FHA loan rider addresses those FHA requirements and should be used when NAHASDA funds are invested in any property that carries an FHA, loan. So that's the one you would use for that. So that is the end of the useful life thing. There's an attachment in there that, the things that you have to track, but somebody has to be tracking that. You have to have that binding commitment, and you have to make sure that it runs with the land. Some of the other various federal requirements. This is me years ago when we got the Hearth Act signed. I testified numerous amount of times getting that put into place. And I was invited to watch the president sign it into law. So all those other federal requirements we talked about, you got to make sure somebody within your staff or your program is paying attention. Uniform relocation assistance and real property. Davis-Bacon, we just talked about that yesterday. NEPA, you heard about it today, although you probably didn't want to. Flood Disaster Protection Act, lead-based paint, and then 2 CFR Part 200, that Uniform Administrative Act, and all of the things that requires us to do. We have non-discrimination laws. Age Discrimination Act of 1975, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the Indian Civil Rights Act of 68, Title VI, Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 68. Some of those don't apply to us because of the fact that Congress gives us the money for the purpose of low-income Native Americans. Therefore, it's not discrimination. That's how we're allocated our money. Some of the major requirements include but are not limited to NEPA, Davis-Bacon. You guys know all about those now. The Indian Civil Rights Act, we'll talk about that throughout the week, as well as the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. You have certifications that you are making as tribal leaders when you sign that IHP, that APR, that you are certifying. Okay, this one is for our wealthier tribes, that you do have households within your jurisdiction at or below 80% of median income in order to receive those NAHASDA funds. This one, that you're going to comply with the Civil Rights Act. And certifications apply only, under certain conditions. If you expand your formula area, then there's certain conditions that you have to show that you're servicing people within your formula area, your expanded formula area, that you maintain adequate insurance coverage for your housing owned and assisted. We'll talk about that in the week because that's another area of slippage we have. Policies that are in effect and available for review. Guys, we got to make sure that you got all the policies you need, that you have proof of adoption, and that you can find them, that they're in a depository. Get you into trouble quicker than anything. I go out and I do this a lot to make sure that tribal programs have all the policies and that they're NAHASDA compliant. They're in effect and available for review by HUD and the public. You're certifying to that twice a year. Make sure that they are, okay? Governing your management, your maintenance, your payments, your rent, your A&O policy is one of the most important ones that you have. Your uniform relocation assistance and real property, you have to comply with that. It's found at 1014. You have to maintain those records to demonstrate that compliance. Have to notify any relocating families, individuals, businesses. You have to really think about it if you buy something and there's existing people there, okay? We're not supposed to house non-native people unless they are essential or they're law enforcement. This provision has stopped some people from buying apartment buildings like during COVID and things like that because we're responsible for those people and those businesses or those properties that we buy. Responsible for paying temporary relocation, displacement benefits. The cost of relocation assistance is an eligible program cost. And I'm almost done, guys. Specific requirements, relocation, real property acquisition. You have to use certain appraisers, okay? Not anybody can appraise tribal land, for one thing. Must be appraised on an appraised value. You can accept donated property. You can purchase property. You cannot pay over fair market value with NAHASDA funds, okay? Requires HUD approval if that purchase price exceeds your fair market value. You have to minimize displacement. Take all the reasonable steps to minimize displacement of persons, household, businesses, nonprofit organizations. Temporary relocation covers your tenants and homebuyer relocation cost and adequate advance notice if you have to have them move for any reason. There's a fire. You discover, methamphetamine being used in an apartment building and you have to make sure that the rest of the building is safe. Things like that, that you would never, ever think that could happen, sometimes does. And you have to make sure you're adhering to that. If you have a question, call your HUD office. They'll tell you, hey, do I have to pay relocation? What do I need to do here? Most of the time our tribal people will say, yeah, we have a hotel. Let's move them over to a hotel or whatever. But, sometimes you don't have that. Relocation and acquisition, we're subject to 49 CFR Part 24, negotiating fair market value when it's a voluntary transaction, following involuntary procedures when it's required by the URA. So relocation assistance for displaced persons, if it's a permanent relocation, it talks about the appeals to you as a recipient and your responsibilities. The cost of the required relocation assistance is an eligible expense. They always tell you to try to get it from a different source like the tribe, but you can take it out of your NAHASDA funds, and you have to maintain records in sufficient detail to demonstrate compliance with 1014. And then you have, your affordable housing developed, acquired, or assisted under your block grant program has to be cost and design standards. We can only build moderate housing. So you have to stay within your TDCs, and that's in your reference materials also. Moderate design defined at housing, this is a hard definition to argue with because you'll have a hard time finding something like that. Must be of moderate design defined as housing of a size and amenity consistent with unassisted housing offered for sale in your tribal geographic area to buyers who are at or below the area median income. So they're talking low income to begin with. It applies to all housing assisted, such as development, acquisition, new construction, moderate, substantial rehab of affordable housing, or homebuyer assistance and model activities. And then you have the non-dwelling cost and design standards that we have to adhere to. Must be able to support the reasonableness and necessity for the factors used within your activity, have to document a need, a problem to be solved, how it supports your housing activities, okay? So the way in which you demonstrate meeting moderate design is stay within the TDC. If you can't, you can adopt written standards for your affordable housing, which reflect the requirements specified at 156, explaining the basis for your standards, using similar housing within your tribe's geographic area, has to be available for review by the public and HUD, has to have a comparison of your cost using your standards and the total development cost for your area. It would not require HUD approval if it doesn't exceed 10% of your published TDC maximum for your project, okay? Non-dwelling structures have to support an affordable housing activity and design, size, and feature. Amenities have to be reasonable. You can read about that at 1060. If you have funds for two different sources, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if the tribe gives you the money. You have to utilize the standards of the funding source with the more restrictive rules apply. You can write and adopt written standards for non-dwelling structures, describe the criteria to be used for the cost, size, and design. Almost done. Flood insurance, okay? If you are in a FEMA identified special flood hazard area, it requires participation in the National Flood Insurance Program or private flood insurance. Many of our reservations have not been mapped by FEMA, okay? So under the Flood Disaster Protection Act, you cannot permit the use of federal financial assistance for acquisition or construction, including rehab, in an area identified by FEMA as having a special flood hazard unless certain conditions are met. The community in which the area is situated is participating in a national flood insurance program in accordance with 202A of the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 73. Less than a year has passed since FEMA notification regarding flood hazards. For this purposes, your community is your government entity, such as an Indian tribe, an authorized tribal organization, Alaska Native village, an authorized Native organization, a municipality, a county that has that authority to adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations for your area, and where your community is participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. Flood insurance on the building is obtained in compliance with 102 of the Disaster Protection Act, provided that that financial assistance is in the form of a loan or an insurance or a guarantee of a loan. The amount of the flood insurance required need not exceed the outstanding principal balance of the loan and need not be required beyond the term of that particular loan. Lead-based paint, 1978, when pretty much that law came about, they used to make the executive directors go get a certification in that. I had to go to Dallas, Texas, and rode around the airport. That's where it was at, the Hilton at the airport, test out on it. And we were there for 3.5 days testing on that stuff. And you had to be certified in lead-based paint, basically the requirements and abatement procedures. So 1040 is where you read about that. The poisoning prevention requirements, they apply to all of our activities under NAHASDA. The applicable requirements are found at 35 subparts A, B, H, J, K, M, R of the title. You have to implement your lead-based paint poisoning prevention act. It requires certain things like you give out, I was going to say paraphernalia, paperwork, describing that. You can go to this as an active link here. That regulation took place in 2000. If your units were built after 1978, you wouldn't have lead-based paint in them. I had a client that got a finding for that. And I said, excuse me, these were all built in the 90s. Why would we give out this information to the tenants in this apartment building? I argued for them. And she's like, I said, what would make you happy so they never get a finding like this again? And they said, well, put it on your standardized tenant homebuyer file checklist. And all you guys that do, A&O stuff, all these stuff is you require to have a complete application package and the checklist for them moving in and things like that. You just make a little statement on there. All units were built in 1990 or whatever, after 1978. So therefore they contain no lead-based paint, and we do not hand out the required, paperwork. But the area of slippage is if you guys are giving rehab out, things like that, it's going to apply to those units, okay? If you give tenant-based rental assistance, energy assistance, all of that, you have to now make sure that you adhere to those lead-based paint requirements, okay? So don't get a finding for that. If nothing else, this is one thing I try to do is make sure that you guys don't get any findings. Okay. Exemptions. So I talked about Title VI, I talked about Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, okay? No person shall, on the grounds of race, color, origin, be excluded for participation, be denied, we are exempt from those two particular laws. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 64, Title VIII of 68 shall not apply to actions by recognized tribes, tribally designated housing entities under the NAHASDA Act. Because of the way that we receive the money, it's for the benefit of Native Americans, okay? That's what allows us not to adhere to that. You'll hear that once in a while. I've even seen it on Facebook when the tribe goes to apply or puts out a job and they say, how can they do that? That's discrimination. No, it's not. It depends on how we get the money. And it's the same thing as so this is one you might want to take a snapshot of because you might hear this argument in your years to come. Okay, we are exempt from those though. I'm sorry I ran over, guys, almost 13 minutes. Please forgive me. Please come back tomorrow. It'll be a lot less boring, I promise you. This was the driest of the subjects. Okay, guys?
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Again, and thank you so much for your time and your effort with the presentation. I definitely learned a lot. That was a lot of great information.
Hopefully, Renee, poor Renee up in Alaska having a hard time. I work up in Alaska. Sometimes it's challenging up there, but I love it.
I believe it. I can believe it.
You guys gotta do a survey for her and come back tomorrow, please.
Definitely, for sure. To all of the attendees, as I close out the webinar, please feel free to submit any other questions or comments that you may have for Cheryl. I am also going to go ahead and copy and paste the link for today's survey. I'll go ahead and put it in the public chat. Okay, yeah, Renee, I can definitely send you the information. I'm sorry that you had so many issues. Hopefully we can get you back up and everything will be fine tomorrow for you. So I put the survey inside of the public chat. Please take a moment to complete our survey about today's webinar. And it only takes about a minute or so. Your feedback really, really helps us so that we can do more of what is working well and also improve on the areas that may need to be improved on. We do invite you to be as candid as possible on the surveys because it is anonymous. Okay, and then we also hope that you can join us for our next webinar. Of course, the next one will be with Cheryl. It's going to be day 3. And we also encourage you to just, let us know what you loved about the survey again on the feedback survey information. You can do that for today, and then I'll also send another link for tomorrow. And then also feel free to access today's webinars and any other recorded webinars at our Kadita Webinars archive that's now posted to our YouTube channel. And you can feel free to view them and share them with your colleagues and any of your friends. Also, please check out our upcoming events posted on our various social medias. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, as well as LinkedIn. We also have an in-house produced podcast called the Hopathinga Native American Podcast, where we discuss more focused topics within the Native American housing and self-determination. You can also listen to us on Simplecast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, as well as view the video recordings with our guests on YouTube. If you don't have any other questions, once again, thank you so much for participating and joining us today. I hope that you all have a fantastic rest of your day, and we hope to connect with you very soon. I'm going to leave this up so that if you guys want to grab any of the links inside of the shared notes, you can do so. And yeah, that's it. We hope that you have a good day, you guys.
Thank you, guys. Be safe. Come back tomorrow, please.
Yeah, bye, Cheryl. Have a good day.
Bye.
You are currently the only person in this conference.